Hello, I'm here to introduce you to a very famous scenario known as the prisoner's dilemma. It's been studied by many people outside of philosophy. It's of particular interest to economists and social theorists, but we're going to find that it has pretty distinct, interesting applications in moral philosophy. Now, some of you might actually be familiar with this from other coursework. If so, please play along. Keep an open mind about it. What you see here might very well represent a slightly different take on what you've been exposed to in the past. If you are unfamiliar with this, though, please play along as well. I'm going to present some interesting choices to you. Now, I suppose you'll have to use your imagination a bit with this one. I imagine that no one who's watching this video is a criminal. No one would contemplate doing something like this, but just imagine that you are a criminal, a bank robber, let's say, and you attempted a robbery with one accomplice. Let's say that this was a partner, but not a friend, not a relative, not anyone you know very well, and not someone you necessarily trust. That'll be important later, but let's get that out there now. The two of you have been arrested. The police suspect that the two of you committed this robbery. They're right, but right now they can't prove it. Now, the prosecutor in this case wouldn't have much of a case against either of you unless at least one of you cooperates. It's not a very unrealistic scenario so far. So the cops want to interrogate each of you separately, and they're going to try to get each of you to rat out your partner, to tell them what they need to know, to at least, at the very least, go after the other person. It's very common for police in these sorts of circumstances to separate suspects, so certainly they can't get their story straight, they can't make any kind of pact with one another. So I'm not even sure that that matters, but let's just assume that given that you don't know your partner very well, the two of you never had the opportunity to get together and say something like, well, if we get caught, let's agree that we'll do this, that both of us will say nothing, both of us will be loyal, nothing like this, and you're not even sure what story the two of you would get straight. So, to get you to rat out your partner, the police offer you a deal. Your partner is actually offered the same deal, but neither of you knows that for sure. Both of you have no way of communicating. At the very least, you don't know what your partner would decide. Maybe you would assume that your partner has been offered the same deal. But it's this. If you rat out your partner, you'll get no more than 3 years in prison. You will get that sentence if your partner rats you out. If you talk and your partner does not, you will go free and he or she will get 10 years in prison. And the reverse holds as well. If your partner talks and you don't, your partner goes free and you get 10 years in prison. And if neither of you talk, you each get 1 year in prison. So here it is on the screen for you. You might even want to pause and read this carefully. Both you and your partner are offered this deal, but you're offered it separately, and that's important. So, as I suggested, you ought to leave aside the issue of loyalty as you make this decision. If nothing else, assume that you don't expect your partner to act out of loyalty, and your partner might not be a particularly good person. Focus on this question. What choice is in your best interest? Really, you have two choices, to speak or not to speak. Do you keep quiet or rat out your partner? You should decide and make a note of your choice. You should consider that you are not the sole master of your destiny at this juncture. How much jail time you actually wind up with depends not just on what you decide, but what your partner decides, and you have no knowledge and no control of that. So think carefully. What would you do in this situation? I'd like to give you one more moment to think about this before we move on. I don't want to present this necessarily as a solution, although some might regard it in just that way. I'll put it this way. Many social scientists, many mathematicians, in fact, have pointed to a rational decision in this case. You might want to take a moment to think about what that might be. What is your best bet? So, if you're still thinking about it, you might want to pause the video right now. Make a note of what decision you'll make. Don't worry, no actual jail time will come of this, but once you unpause the video, you'll be ready for us to move on. We're going to take a step back and try to analyze this little problem of ours. So, if you've unpaused the video, now you're looking at how we're going to analyze this. And we're going to try to make it a little less personal, more impersonal at this point. Let's say our two criminal accomplices are J and K, like the people from Men in Black. They've been arrested, the police are interrogating them. Same situation, but we'll look at this in the third person now, so it seems like less of a personal choice, an agonizing one that you would have to make. Now, decision theorists would analyze this, perhaps using a table, a matrix like this. It might look a little bit intimidating, but we're going to make sense of it together. There are two choices here. Each party, J and K, is faced with the same choice. Again, they're doing it separately. They're not able to cooperate. Choice A is do not talk to the police. Choice B, talk to the police. Now you'll see that this table is organized so that horizontally you have K's choices, vertically you have J's choices. So horizontally it's divided in choice A and B, likewise for the vertical part of this. And you'll see that here it's divided up into 4 sections. Each of these represents the outcome, with the first number in the pair being the outcome for J, the second number in the pair being the outcome for K. That is to say, then, that if J and K both make choice A, they both do not talk to the police, then they each get 1 year in prison. This is because, use your imagination, the prosecutor, the judge are able to convict on a lesser charge. They can get something on them if they both don't talk to the police. In terms of combined number of years, one might look at this as the best combined outcome, maybe the best they could hope for. Each of them is out in a year. All things considered, that's the least combined jail time you see in any other outcome. Not that that necessarily matters. You could expect that both J and K are each going for that prize, no time in prison. We'll see. On the other hand, if J chooses not to talk to the police and K does talk to the police, then we're looking at this square where J's A meets K's B and we get 10-0. That means that J gets 10 years in prison because he did not cooperate, and K walks free because he did cooperate. And you'll see that it's reversed in the situation where K doesn't talk to the police, but J does. In the situation where both of them talk to the police, then they both get 3 years. They're both providing evidence that the police can use against both parties. I hope that's clear so far. Now we might be in a better position, now that we've been able to represent this visually, why there is one decision here that, from a certain point of view at least, is the rational one. Let's look at this closely then. And now let's say that you're J. Let's consider these decisions from J's point of view. Now you don't know for certain what K is going to decide, but there are 2 alternatives. Either he'll cooperate with the police or he won't. Let's assume that he is cooperating with the police. In that case, what do you do to minimize your jail time? If he's cooperating and you don't cooperate, you'll get 10 years in prison. He'll walk free, he or she will, but that might not be relevant to you. You might only be concerned with minimizing your jail time. In order to do that, you need to cooperate as well. If K cooperates, if your partner cooperates and you do not, you receive 10 years in prison. Your only choice would be to cooperate as well and reduce your sentence from 10 years to 3. Now, again, you don't know that K actually is cooperating, but you have to think, if that's what K's doing, this is what I have to do. On the other hand, what if K is not cooperating? In that case, what do you do to minimize your own jail sentence? If K is not speaking to the police, if he's not cooperating with them, then if you do likewise, you each wind up with 1 year in prison. You wind up with 1 year in prison, most importantly, but at that point you have an opportunity to cooperate with the police yourself and walk free right away, more or less. You get no years in prison. Your partner gets 10, your former partner I should say, but that's irrelevant to you. You're concerned with minimizing your jail time. Look at what we just did. We just established that no matter which decision K makes, in either case, the decision that minimizes your jail time is to cooperate with the police. But that's just what K would be thinking, or should be thinking, if K is also concerned with minimizing the jail sentence. That means, from both your point of view and your partner's point of view, from both J and K's point of view, the rational choice is to cooperate with the police. So, both parties do that, both parties rat each other out, and they each wind up with 3 years in prison. Now, this is what you might call a rational choice in this situation. Both parties are making the only rational choice, given that they can't make a pact with one another, they can't coordinate their actions, and this is where they wind up. Now, this comes as a surprise if you consider that if only they could somehow have gotten their acts together, both agreed, this is what they're going to do. Both parties might wish that the other person would do that. They would minimize their collective jail sentences, but of course, the moment one has reason to think that the other person is going to clam up and not speak to the police, they would take that opportunity to speak to the police themselves and get off. And then the other person, pardon my language, is really screwed. So they wind up here. But this, for both parties, is worse than this other outcome. So what's happened? In fact, we're considering the prisoner's dilemma as a model of something related to this other idea we're studying, the tragedy of the commons, one that in some respects is more relevant to a number of moral problems. Let me repeat some of what I just said and summarize. Another way of putting this, choice B, cooperating with the police, is the dominant strategy for both parties. Given that some elements of this are out of the control of each party, it's a fair question to ask, what does J do? What choice does J make if K is making choice A? What choice should J make if K is making choice B? Turns out that it's the same. No matter what K chooses, there's one rational choice for J. It's choice B, and so decision theorists would call that the dominant strategy. The rational choice for each party is to confess, no matter what the other party chooses to do. So we've been over that. We explained that what this means is that each party making the rational choice winds up in a situation where they're worse off than if they had just both made the other choice. Both of them would have been better off if they had both not confessed, not ratted each other out to the police, and gotten 1 year sentences. Therein lies the problem. So you might think, about this, ask how could the prisoner's dilemma scenario be changed so that this, what they call a suboptimal result, does not come about? Long story short, if both parties were in a position where they could coordinate with each other, perhaps they share a lawyer who can broker some sort of agreement between the two of them that neither of them will cooperate with the police, but instead they'll cooperate with each other. If there were some way that each could lord a credible threat over the other. Well, I may be going away for 10 years if you cheat and you throw me under the bus, so to speak, but I'll get out someday and I'll come after you. Now, that's not the sort of thing I'd advise in an ethics class, of course, but we're thinking about this from the point of view of criminals. If they could issue such a threat, that might be one way of making sure that this agreement we're talking about holds. And if it did hold, so that both parties were comfortable taking this risk, so to speak, then they could both make the choice to not speak with the police, not cooperate with them, but with each other, and they get some jail time. Each of them would be in for a year, but that's better than 3 years apiece. As the scenario is designed, as the prisoner's dilemma is designed, they don't have that option. There's really no way to strike an agreement, let alone enforce it. And that's why they're faced with the dilemma we've been speaking about. We studied the prisoner's dilemma just now, not because the scenario is interesting for its own sake, although you very well might have found it interesting, but rather it exemplifies a problem with rational decision making that's going to rear its head in any number of situations, not the least of which is this so-called tragedy of the commons, which you may have read about. It's part of our assigned reading. The classic statement of a tragedy of the commons involves land that is held in common. Certain farmers are putting their cows out to pasture, and self-interest leads each of them to do something that makes each of them worse off. So I thought I might present a different example here just to illustrate this in a slightly different context, but you really should think of this as just another tragedy of the commons. But this one occurs at sea, not on land. R and S, excuse the abbreviations, I'm not feeling very imaginative today. R and S are competing fishing fleets using the same area of ocean. Commercial fishers, they catch fish by the boatload. But one complicating factor here is that the sea does not hold an unlimited number of fish. And both fleets, or the heads of both fleets, recognize that there's a certain danger in fishing heavily. If they do this, if they catch more fish, if they catch fish at a greater rate than the fish populations can replenish themselves, then the population might collapse. So, from one point of view at least, both parties see that it's in their interest to fish moderately. Now, you might think of these numbers here as tons of catch, and this is grossly oversimplified, I'm sure, but we're just trying to make a few points here. If both fishing fleets, R and S, if they both take choice A, they both fish moderately, then each of them winds up with 50 tons of fish. Not a bad haul at all. And both of them would do well to catch this much. But each of them recognizes this. If the other one is making choice A, is fishing moderately, then if I fish heavily, then I could really make a killing here. I could catch 75 tons of fish, and the other party will only be left with 10. How does that work? Why is it that the numbers don't add up to the same? That the total haul, if both fish moderately, is 100 tons, but the total is only 85 tons if one party fishes heavily and the other doesn't? Well, you might think that the total number of fish available will be less if just one party is fishing heavily, because they'll be depleting the fish population. It's not going to grow as quickly over the course of a season, let's say. So if R chooses to fish heavily and S does not, then R does really well, gets 75 tons. S only gets 10 tons. S is, again, screwed. And we'll see that the reverse happens if S fishes heavily and R only fishes moderately. Now, this is just like the prisoner's dilemma. You could imagine both parties analyzing this in just the same way. R doesn't know what S is going to do. R doesn't know what S is doing. But they figure, if S fishes heavily, then it's in my interest to fish heavily as well. However, if S is fishing moderately, then it's also in my interest to fish heavily as well. But S is thinking the same thing. Both parties see it in their advantage, see it in their interest to fish heavily, despite the fact that that results in a catastrophe. Their heavy fishing causes the fish population to collapse entirely. They both wind up with catches of only 25 tons. Each winds up with half of what they have caught if only they had both been able to fish moderately. So the numbers are a bit different, but this is essentially the same as the prisoner's dilemma we just studied. We find that truly rational decision-making on the part of each party, when they're not able to coordinate with each other and come to some agreement that they can enforce, is going to lead each party to a suboptimal result. Both fishing fleets will fish heavily, and so each will only have half as great a catch as if they would have both fished moderately. Here's the moral of the story then. Both parties know what's in their best interest. They know what the best outcome is, but neither of them is in a position on their own to get there. You can't expect R and S to be able to coordinate and to rely on each other to get to the result that's really best for both of them. So instead of winding up here, they wind up here. We've established that. Now, we're considering problems like this, not just because we're concerned about the fish, although this does shed some light on some moral problems related to the environment. The idea is that many environmental issues actually arise from so-called tragedies of the commons, where individuals damage the environment because they're acting in their self-interest, but their self-interest is actually defeating for them, even leaving aside the effects on the environment. We're concerned with this in large part because this is a sort of moral problem that doesn't really lend itself to any sort of solution from a utilitarian point of view or a Kantian point of view. We're going to look to yet another tradition now. This unit of the course involves what some call social contract theory. And for some, the basis of this social contract theory is a recognition that problems like this need a solution. What would be the solution here anyway? How do we get both parties to fish moderately? If we can't just rely upon their sense of self-interest, in these circumstances, what could we do? In the standard tragedy of the commons, the solution is to partition the land. Each farmer gets a fenced-off area and their cows graze on that. You can't really do that here. I mean, sure, maybe you could limit the two fishing fleets to different areas of the sea, but that doesn't mean anything to the fish. They get to swim around. So there really is no way to fence off this. You might regulate their catches. That's one idea. These ships have to come to port. Fishing boats come to port. They unload. They sell their catches. Perhaps there's a way to simply not allow their fish to sell anything that results, anything that goes beyond moderate fishing. That would be a way to enforce an agreement that both of these parties would want to accept. So we'll leave it at that. We're going to move on with these insights in hand to begin to study this so-called social contract theory.